The morning of December 10, 1941, broke clear and bright over the South China Sea, the kind of tropical day that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Lieutenant Commander James Hargrove stood on the bridge of HMS Prince of Wales, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the empty horizon for any sign of the Japanese invasion fleet they had been hunting. Behind him, Captain John Leach moved between chart table and compass, his face betraying the exhaustion of 2 sleepless nights at sea. Prince of Wales was the pride of the Royal Navy, a King George V class battleship commissioned just 8 months earlier, displacing 43,000 tons and armed with 10 14-inch guns in quadruple and twin turrets. She was so new that civilian workers from Camel Laird shipyard were still aboard, completing repairs from damage sustained during her encounter with the German battleship Bismarck in May. That battle had been her baptism by fire, and now, barely 6 months later, she found herself on the other side of the world, facing a different enemy in waters far from home. "Nothing, sir," Hargrove reported, lowering his binoculars. "No sign of enemy transports off Kuantan." Captain Leach nodded grimly. The intelligence that had brought Force Z this far north, reports of Japanese landings at Kuantan on the Malayan coast, had proven false. They had steamed through dangerous waters, maintaining radio silence, hoping to surprise the enemy and destroy their invasion convoys before they could land troops. Instead, they had found empty seas and wasted precious hours. "Signal repulse," Leach ordered. "We're returning to Singapore." 500 yards to starboard, HMS Repulse kept station, her older battlecruiser design making her slightly faster but far less armoured than Prince of Wales. Together, the 2 capital ships formed the core of Force Z, Admiral Sir Tom Phillips's attempt to provide naval deterrence against Japanese aggression in Southeast Asia. 4 destroyers, Electra, Express, Vampire and Tenedos, screened them. But what Force Z critically lacked was air cover. The aircraft carrier Indomitable had been meant to accompany them, but she had run aground in the West Indies and was under repair. Without her fighters, the task force was vulnerable to air attack, but Admiral Phillips, flying his flag aboard Prince of Wales, had decided to proceed anyway. The strategic situation was desperate. Japanese forces were landing all along the Malayan coast, and Singapore's northern defences were already being tested. Phillips believed that the mere presence of modern British capital ships would force the Japanese to be cautious, perhaps even withdraw. He was about to discover how wrong he was. In the Admiral's sea cabin behind the bridge, Phillips reviewed the situation with his staff. At 53, he was short, intense, and utterly convinced that properly handled capital ships could defend themselves against air attack. He had spent his career in the Mediterranean and had little experience with naval aviation. More critically, he had missed the lessons of Taranto, where British torpedo bombers had devastated the Italian fleet at anchor, and he didn't fully appreciate what modern aerial torpedoes could do to even the most heavily armoured warships. "Gentlemen, we return to Singapore," Phillips said, his finger tracing their route on the chart. "We've been spotted by enemy submarines and aircraft. They know we're here, but we maintain radio silence. We don't want to give away our exact position or alert the enemy that we're withdrawing. This decision, to maintain radio silence even after being detected, would prove fatal." Below decks in Prince of Wales, the ship's company went about their duties with the practiced efficiency of Royal Navy sailors. In the forward 14-inch turrets, gun crews cleaned and maintained their massive weapons. In the engine rooms, stokers fed the boilers that produced steam for the turbines. In the wireless room, radiomen listened to frequencies but transmitted nothing, per the Admiral's orders. Among them was able seaman Robert Hughes, a 20-year-old from Cardiff serving as a loader in a turret. Hughes had joined the Navy in 1939, seeking adventure and escape from the Welsh coal mines, where his father had worked his entire life. He had found adventure, though not the kind he'd imagined. The battle against Bismarck had been terrifying. The German battleship's shells had straddled Prince of Wales, one penetrating the bridge and killing everyone except Captain Leach and the chief yeoman. Hughes had heard the screams over the ship's intercom, had felt the vibrations of enemy shells striking armour. "Think we'll see action today, Bobby?" asked his turret mate, Seaman Eric Morrison, a cheerful cockney from London's East End, who seemed incapable of taking anything seriously. "Hope not," Hughes replied honestly. "Hope we get back to Singapore, get some leave, maybe find a cold beer." "Fat chance of that. Did you hear? The Japs bombed Singapore yesterday, and they've landed troops all over the north. We might not have a Singapore to go back to." Hughes didn't want to think about that. Singapore was the Gibraltar of the East, the greatest naval base in Asia. Impregnable. It had to be, because if Singapore fell, the entire region would fall with it. At 10:50 hours, lookouts spotted aircraft approaching from the north. At first, there was hope they might be British. Perhaps the RAF had finally sent fighters from Singapore. But as the planes drew closer, their silhouettes became clear. Twin-engine bombers with fixed landing gear and long greenhouse canopies. Japanese Navy Type 96 Nell bombers from the 22nd Air Flotilla. "Air raid warning red," the klaxon blared throughout the ship. "All hands to action stations." Men ran to their posts. Watertight doors clanged shut, sealing the ship into isolated compartments. Anti-aircraft guns swung skyward. In the fire control director high above the bridge, officers tracked the approaching bombers, feeding data to the multiple 5.25-inch high-angle guns that formed Prince of Wales's anti-aircraft defence. The first wave, 8 bombers from the Mihoro Air Corps, attacked at 11:13 hours, targeting Repulse. Hughes watched from his position in the turret as bombs fell toward the older battlecruiser, geysers of water erupting around her as she manoeuvred violently to avoid hits. One bomb struck Repulse's deck, but she continued on, apparently undamaged. "They're after Repulse," Morrison said. "Maybe they'll leave us alone." But at 11:40 hours, a second wave arrived. 17 Nell torpedo bombers from the Genzan Air Group. 9 of them broke toward Prince of Wales, flying low over the water at 200 feet, their torpedoes visible beneath their fuselages. "Torpedo bombers!" the gunnery officer's voice crackled over the intercom. "Port side! All anti-aircraft batteries engage!" The 5.25-inch guns opened up with a roar that shook the entire ship. Pom-pom guns added their rapid staccato bark. Tracer rounds arced across the sky, creating a wall of fire that the Japanese had to penetrate. One bomber exploded in mid-air, hit by a direct burst. 2 others wavered, trailing smoke, but continued their attack runs. On the bridge, Captain Leach ordered harder starboard, trying to present the narrowest target to the torpedoes. The massive battleship heeled over as she turned, her engines at full power, creating a boiling wake. But she was too big, too heavy, too slow to evade 9 torpedoes converging from multiple angles. Hughes felt, rather than heard the impact, a tremendous boom that seemed to lift the entire ship, followed by violent shaking. The lights flickered. The deck tilted beneath his feet. "We're hit!" someone shouted over the intercom. The torpedo had struck port side aft, right where the outer port propeller shaft exited the hull. It was the worst possible location. The explosion twisted the shaft, which was turning at maximum revolutions, and ruptured the shaft glands, the seals that prevented seawater from entering through the shaft tunnel. The sea poured in through the breached glands at a catastrophic rate, 2,400 tons of water in the first minutes. In the aft engine room, Chief Petty Officer William Armstrong was at his post when the torpedo hit. The compartment was directly adjacent to the shaft tunnel, and when the glands failed, seawater came roaring through like a river. Armstrong saw 3 of his men swept away by the torrent before he could even shout a warning. "Close the watertight doors," he screamed. "Seal the compartment." But water was pouring in faster than the pumps could handle. The aft engine room was flooding rapidly, and with it, electrical power to half the ship was failing. More critically, the flooding was asymmetrical, all on the port side, creating a list that grew worse with each passing minute. On the bridge, damage control reports painted a grim picture. Port shaft tunnel flooded, Y turret out of action due to power loss, port outer propeller stopped, ship listing 5 degrees to port and increasing, speed reduced to 15 knots. Admiral Phillips stood beside Captain Leach, his face ashen as he realized what was happening. Prince of Wales, the great battleship that was supposed to deter Japanese aggression, was crippled, and the Japanese were far from finished with them. At 12:20 hours, a third wave of Japanese aircraft arrived, 26 torpedo bombers and land-based bombers that had been searching for Force Z. They spotted the damaged Prince of Wales trailing behind Repulse, moving slowly, listing, obviously wounded. Like sharks scenting blood, they converged on the stricken battleship. "Here they come again," the lookout warned. This time there were too many. The Japanese attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, an anvil attack designed to leave the ship no room to maneuver. If Prince of Wales turned left to avoid torpedoes from that side, she would turn directly into torpedoes from the right. The anti-aircraft guns fired continuously, their barrels glowing hot. Spent shell casings littered the decks. Men fed ammunition as fast as they could load it. But for every bomber they hit, 3 more got through. At 12:23 hours, 3 more torpedoes struck Prince of Wales in rapid succession. One hit the port side amidships. Another struck forward, near A turret. The third hit port side aft, near where the first torpedo had already devastated the shaft tunnel. Each impact was a hammer blow that rocked the 43,000-ton ship. Bulkheads buckled. Compartments flooded. Men drowned in spaces that became tombs in seconds as water rose faster than they could escape. In A turret, Hughes felt the deck tilt sharply. The list was now 15 degrees to port, and increasing. Inside the turret, shells and equipment that hadn't been properly secured began sliding toward the low side. A 14-inch shell weighing nearly a ton broke loose and rolled across the turret space, crushing Seaman Morrison against the bulkhead before anyone could react. Hughes heard his friend's screams, heard the sickening crunch of bone, but couldn't reach him. The turret was tilting further, the deck becoming a slope. Men clung to anything bolted down. "Abandon turret," the turret officer ordered. "All crew, abandon turret and proceed topside." They scrambled up the ladders, climbing now at a steep angle, as the ship continued to list. Hughes emerged onto the main deck and stopped, stunned by what he saw. The entire port side was under water. Men were already in the sea, hundreds of them, swimming away from the ship or clinging to debris. The destroyer express had come alongside to starboard, trying to take off survivors, but the gap between the two ships kept widening as Prince of Wales rolled further over. On the bridge, Captain Leach knew his ship was doomed. "Pass the word to abandon ship," he ordered quietly. "All hands not engaged in damage control. Abandon ship." Admiral Phillips stood beside him, refusing to leave. Throughout the action, Phillips had maintained his characteristic calm, but now his composure cracked. He had brought these men into battle without air cover, had maintained radio silence when he should have called for help, had underestimated the effectiveness of aerial torpedoes. Nearly 1,300 men were aboard Prince of Wales, and hundreds of them were about to die because of his decisions. "Tom, you should go," Captain Leach said to the Admiral. "Save yourself." "No," Phillips replied. "I chose to engage without air cover. I chose to maintain radio silence. These men die because of my decisions. I'll stay with them." Below decks, the situation was desperate. In flooded compartments, men tried frantically to open watertight doors that had been dogged shut, trapping them inside. Damage control parties worked to shore up bulkheads, but it was hopeless. Too much damage, too much flooding, the list too severe. Chief Petty Officer Armstrong, still in the flooding aft engine room, directed his surviving men toward the escape ladder. "Get topside! Now! That's an order!" "What about you, Chief?" one of them asked. "I'm staying until everyone else is out. Now move!" They climbed, and Armstrong followed, but halfway up the ladder the ship lurched further to port, and he lost his grip. He fell back into the rising water, striking his head on a pipe bracket. Dazed, bleeding, he tried to climb again, but his strength was gone. The water reached his waist, his chest, his neck. He had time for one thought, of his wife Elizabeth and their 3 daughters in Portsmouth, before the water closed over his head. On deck, Hughes helped launch life rafts and tried to assist men into the water. The list was now past 30 degrees. Walking was impossible without holding onto rails or ropes. The starboard side of the ship, now the high side, was rising out of the water, exposing the bilge keels. "Jump!" an officer shouted. "Jump clear of the ship before she rolls over." Men jumped, plummeting 20, 30, 40 feet into the oil-slicked sea. Some hit the water cleanly and swam clear. Others hit debris or the ship's hull and didn't surface. Hughes waited until the last possible moment, then climbed over the side and slid down the exposed starboard hull, his hands and knees scraping against barnacles and rivets, until he reached the water and let go. The sea was warm but filthy, covered with a thick layer of fuel oil from ruptured tanks. Hughes surfaced, coughing, spitting oil, his eyes burning. All around him, hundreds of men struggled in the water, their faces blackened by oil, their movements growing weaker as exhaustion and shock set in. At 13:20 hours, barely 2 hours after the first torpedo hit, HMS Prince of Wales rolled completely onto her port side. For a moment she lay there, her starboard side and bottom exposed, men still visible on her hull, some waving, some just clinging desperately to any handhold. Then, with a great roar of escaping air and rushing water, she rolled inverted and began to sink, stern first. Men who had waited too long to jump were carried down with her. Hughes saw them falling into the water as the ship turned turtle, saw them struggling against the suction as the great battleship dragged water and men down with her as she sank. Within 4 minutes, HMS Prince of Wales was gone, leaving only a massive slick of oil, floating debris, and hundreds of men struggling in the sea. 3 miles away, HMS Repulse had suffered a similar fate, struck by multiple torpedoes and sinking at 12:33 hours. The destroyers of Force Z, Express, Electra and Vampire raced between the 2 disaster sites, pulling survivors from the water. But the sea was vast, the oil slick extensive, and some men were simply too far away, too exhausted, too injured to reach. Hughes floated for 2 hours before Vampire's crew hauled him aboard. He lay on the destroyer's deck, vomiting oil, shaking from shock and exhaustion, unable to process what had just happened. Around him, dozens of other survivors lay in similar states. The destroyer's sick bay was overwhelmed. Men with serious injuries were laid on the deck with minimal treatment because there simply weren't enough medical personnel or supplies. As Vampire steamed back towards Singapore, Hughes learned the casualty figures. Of Prince of Wales's crew of approximately 1,300 men, 327 had died, including Admiral Phillips and Captain Leach, both of whom had remained on the bridge as the ship went down. From Repulse, another 513 men were lost. In total, 840 sailors had perished in barely 2 hours of combat, but the numbers didn't convey the real loss. Admiral Phillips's death meant the loss of Force Z's commander. Captain Leach's death meant the loss of a skilled ship handler who had fought Prince of Wales against Bismarck. Chief Petty Officer Armstrong's death meant 3 daughters growing up without a father. Seaman Morrison's death meant a mother in London receiving a telegram that would break her heart. And the strategic loss was even greater. In one morning, Japanese naval aviation had destroyed the only significant Allied naval force between Hawaii and India. Singapore's naval defences were gone. The entire Indian Ocean lay open to Japanese operations. The psychological impact was staggering. Britain's newest, most powerful battleship, sunk by aircraft operating from land bases, proved that air power had fundamentally changed naval warfare. Winston Churchill, receiving the news in London, would later write, "In all the war, I never received a more direct shock." The loss of Prince of Wales and Repulse, coming just 3 days after Pearl Harbor, made clear that the Pacific War would be unlike any previous conflict. For the survivors like Hughes, the war was far from over. Vampire landed them at Singapore on December 11th, but the city was already under siege. Japanese forces were advancing rapidly down the Malayan Peninsula, and Singapore's supposedly impregnable defences were being tested from the landward side, the direction from which the British had never expected attack. Hughes would fight in the defence of Singapore until its surrender on February 15, 1942. He would survive 3 years in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, enduring starvation, disease, and brutal treatment. He would finally return to Wales in 1945, weighing barely 100 pounds, suffering from malaria and dysentery, haunted by memories of friends who had died in the water or in the camps. He never forgot the last moments of HMS Prince of Wales, the sound of rushing water, the screams of trapped men, the sight of the great ship turning turtle and sliding beneath the waves. He never forgot Morrison's crushed body in a turret, or Armstrong's last order to save his men while he stayed behind, or the hundreds of oil-blackened faces in the water calling for help that didn't come in time. In 1971, on the 30th anniversary of the sinking, Hughes returned to Malaya with a group of survivors. They chartered a boat and sailed out to the position where Prince of Wales and Repulse lay on the seafloor, 180 feet beneath the surface. There they held a memorial service, dropping wreaths onto the water while a chaplain read the names of the dead. "They were the best of us," Hughes said during the ceremony, his voice breaking. "They did their duty. They fought their ship. They died bravely. We survived to remember them, to make sure their sacrifice isn't forgotten." HMS Prince of Wales rests on the seafloor to this day, a war grave protected by international law. Divers have visited the wreck over the years, documenting the damage, retrieving artifacts with permission, always treating it with the reverence it deserves. The torpedo damage is still visible, the twisted shaft, the ruptured hull, the evidence of the catastrophic flooding that doomed the ship. In 2002, the British and Malaysian governments designated both wrecks as protected places under the Protection of Military Remains Act. Unauthorized disturbance of the wrecks is prohibited. They are tombs for 840 men who went to war believing they were invincible and discovered that technology and tactics had changed while traditions hadn't. The lessons of Prince of Wales's loss were learned, but at terrible cost. Naval aviation became the dominant form of sea power in the Pacific War. Battleships, once the measure of naval strength, became supporting vessels for aircraft carriers. The age of the battleship was over, ended definitively in the waters off Malaya on December 10, 1941. Robert Hughes died in 2003, age 82, one of the last survivors of Prince of Wales. At his funeral, his grandchildren asked what kind of man he had been. "He was brave," his daughter said. "He survived things that would have broken most people, but he never talked about being a hero. He said the heroes were the men who didn't come back, the men who stayed at their posts while the ship went down, the men who died so others could live." That is the legacy of HMS Prince of Wales and her crew, not a story of defeat, but of courage under impossible circumstances, of men doing their duty even when that duty meant death, of sacrifice that should never be forgotten. The battleship that was supposed to deter Japanese aggression instead became a symbol of how quickly military technology and tactics can overtake strategic planning. But, more importantly, she became a memorial to the men who served aboard her, who fought bravely, who died far from home, and who deserve to be remembered not as casualties of outdated thinking, but as warriors who faced the storm and didn't flinch. Somewhere off the coast of Malaya, 180 feet beneath the waves, HMS Prince of Wales rests with her dead. The wreck deteriorates slowly year by year, but the memory of what happened there on December 10, 1941, must not deteriorate with it. Those men, Phillips and Leach, Armstrong and Morrison, and 836 others, gave their lives in service to their nation. Their last stand, though it ended in defeat, was no less courageous for that. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their story told. And they deserve our gratitude for reminding us that courage isn't about winning. It's about standing firm even when defeat is certain, about doing your duty even when that duty kills you, about being true to your oath and your comrades until the very end. That is the true story of the last stand of HMS Prince of Wales.